To the April Digi event. I'm Alison Chapman. It's my great pleasure to be Vice President of RSVP. And one of my responsibilities is to organise a Digi event series, which happens most months, along with my amazing Digi event committee. And I see many of them here right now, including Claire Horrocks. Welcome, Claire. Um, and I'm also Professor of English in the University of Victoria in BC, Canada. As you might know, our Digi event series happens usually one Friday a month, and we have a wide variety of speakers and topics. And check out our website if you're interested in more information. But for today, we have a speakers platform format where I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Graham Law, who is going to give a talk on commissioned letters to the Times based on his exciting archival work in the Times archive, which is, I believe, in a difficult archive to get access to, and also a difficult place geographically to find as well. Most of you will know Graham's work. Graham is a distinguished scholar of periodicals and a prolific publisher as well. One of his recent books, The Periodical Press Revolution, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's conceptually fantastic, brilliant, new methodological approaches to quantitative research and offers an amazing analysis of the periodical press. He's also worked, of course, on serialized fiction, a 2000 book, Serializing Fiction in the Victorian Press. He's also published with Andrew Mauder, Wilkie Collins, A Literary Life. And he's also, along with Paul Lewis and William Baker and Andrew Gasson, the editor of the correspondence of Wilkie Collins as well, and so much more. So I think, Graham, over to you. Graham is going to be speaking for around 25 minutes, and then we'll open up to discussion and comments and questions. Feel free to post comments and questions in the chat. We'll get to them after Graham's finished talking. And thank you again. And over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Alison, for that very, very generous introduction. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see the slides. It's not even on the first slide, sorry. Okay, back to the beginning. Is that visible to everybody? Is that okay? Sorry, it's not very pretty, but black and red should at least be fairly clear. Just a quick word on this word commissioned, the phrase commissioned letters. It could have been called compensated letters. But I definitely didn't want to call it fake letters, not just because Donald Trump uses the word fake all the time, but because fake is too broad. Fake includes things like pretending that something is true and factual, but when it's actually fictional. I'm not touching on that. What I'm talking about is where people are pretending that something is a personal correspondence when it is actually a professional correspondence. Anyway, that's the title. Have we gone on to the second slide? Is that okay? Good. The organization, there are four main parts. I'm going to talk briefly about the source, which is the Times Archives, and in particular the Editorial Diaries series, which begins in 1857 and continues on. But I stopped, or have stopped so far, in 1870, and that's the period I'm interested in. And all of the attribution work that I was doing comes from that period. The context, I want to look at it very much in that sort of historical context, the mid-Victorian years after the abolition of the taxes on knowledge, the rise of the cheap press, the things that Martin Hewitt has been working on. That is my context, rather than a general history of fake letters. And then I've got two case studies. One comes from earlier in the period, from the early 1860s. Which is during the period of the American Civil War. And I've called it a powerful platform for the Confederate lobbyist from Liverpool. Sorry about the alliteration. That's the heavy, serious one. And there's also a light one called Working Seaside Holidays for the War Correspondent, which is a series of letters going around British holiday resorts, particularly in the north of England. So that's the structure. There'll be a couple of brief comments at the end, and I've got one or two brief introductory remarks to talk about this project in relationship to the work I've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years. Okay, sorry, this is blatant self-promotion. There are 4 volumes I've been involved with, but I want to acknowledge very, very much Jenny Bourne-Taylor and I have been working very closely together over the last 3 or 4 years, using Zoom to meet every week or two. And this work has all been done in one shape or another in cooperation with Jenny. E.S. Dallas is the central character, the critic, the philosopher, if you like, and the journalist E.S. Dallas. 4 volumes on different things. The one that Alison was pointing out to you, which is a theoretical work on media theory based on Dallas's ideas. There's the Gay Science, Dallas's main monograph, which we edited. There's an anthology of his work for the Times, which is also an attributed bibliography trying to pin down everything he wrote for the Times. And last and most recently, I've written a critical biography of Dallas, because I'm afraid even the ODMB doesn't get Dallas wrong. It gets his dad's profession wrong. It gets where he was born wrong and all sorts of things. So anyway, that's what I'm trying to do now is broaden it out much more. I'm going to write a monograph about the Times in the period from 57 to 70 based on the archival materials, and it's going to include a lot more journalists other than Dallas and more than journalists too. So the first bit on sources, the Times archives have gradually moved east. They started off in Printing House Square. They then moved to near London Bridge. Then they ended up in Docklands, in Wapping, in East London. And now, even worse, they've gone into the depths of Essex. Can you see the pictures at the top? They're next to the Thames estuary in the middle of a pretty horrible, noxious and smelly industrial estate, and very noisy too. But please don't let that put you off. It's once you get there, the material is amazing, and it's rather sad how little the archive is used. Particularly, I want to talk about the editorial diaries. If you look at the 3 pictures beneath, the one on the left is a typical spread, 2 days. At the top of each page, you've got the leading articles, who wrote them, what they were about, and then underneath you've got book reviews and other commissioned articles. So that's a typical spread. Occasionally you get the disaster that you find in the middle, where the editor didn't do his job properly and the diary is completely blank. So it's not a complete database, and all that implies. On the right is an amazing discovery that I made. This is a meta diary. You know, the Times doesn't appear on, it's a daily newspaper, but it doesn't appear on a Sunday. So there was a blank page, one in every 7 days. And they used this blank page to collate data for the previous month, both the contents of the newspaper and economic information. And I'm still desperately trying to get a digital copy of this book from the Times archives. And when I do, it will be a tremendous resource. I described it when I was down near the Thames as the holy grail for a book historian. It is a wonderful resource. And as far as I can see, it hasn't been used because it's mislabeled, so nobody had really noticed what it was. Anyway, that's the future. The editorial diaries, as I said, 14 years, 14 volumes, all together, including leaders, book reviews, miscellaneous articles. I've come up with something like 18,000 attributions to a wide range of writers. And there's all sorts of exciting things that come out of it. But the one that really knocked me off my feet was when I collated back the attributions to the newspaper itself. I found nearly 100 of the articles that were commissioned, compensated, paid for, were actually in the form of letters to the editor. I fell off my feet. I couldn't believe it. And that's the basis of this article. All of these commissioned, compensated letters, they're all signed in some form, often with initials or a pseudonym. They're all generally pretty long and pretty professionally written. And quite a few of them appear in series, and that's the ones I'm going to look at. I won't look at the singletons. Okay, that's a bit about the archives and the material I dragged out. Sorry, this is very small print, but this is the table of just the multiple commissioned letters. There's about 8, 9, 10 singletons that are there as well, but these are all of the sets of multiple letters that I came up with, varying from 2 up to 44. And at the top and the bottom, the two biggest series, 44 and 11, those are my case studies. I'm going to call them the S letters because the first one was signed S all the way through from Liverpool, and the final series are the Alpha letters. They were signed from various seaside resorts by Alpha. I'll talk about the authors, the people writing the letters, in a minute. Okay, this is, sorry, apologies to vegetarians, but this is the meat in the sandwich. And I want to make sure I get over these ideas. So rather than just rabbiting on, I'm going to read out a couple of paragraphs. I apologize. I'm more likely to go to sleep because it's midnight in Tokyo, but I hope it won't send you to sleep as well. Okay, so my context for the phenomenon of commission letters is found not in a general history of fake readers' letters in the Victorian press, though perhaps we can discuss that later, but rather I find it among the efforts of the Times to maintain its quasi-monopolistic position in the face of hostility from rival papers. This within a media landscape transformed by the gradual removal after the mid-century of the various fiscal constraints on the press. This new environment fostered the emergence of cheaper dailies in both the metropolis and the provinces. And these new cheap dailies for the first time gave lower class readers quotidian access to both the latest news and commentary on it. And they were soon to displace the Times as the best-selling daily paper. According to the paper's official history, this meant that the struggle to maintain it, I quote, in the dominating position it had held for a generation, was becoming rapidly more difficult, with the proprietor, John Walter, convinced that his staff should, again I quote, make no sort of compromise with the new journalism. Although this term, new journalism, was not to become widely used until rather later in the century, the reference here is clearly not only to socioeconomic factors, low cover price, mass readership, but also to style, both verbal and visual. Personalized reporting, editorial illustration, display advertising. In its stubborn defense of the authorial anonymity characterizing the old journalism, the Times accorded a peculiar status to letters to the editor. They were the only material in the newspaper that could be signed, and indeed had to be signed in some form or another. And I've got one illustration of a particularly nasty controversy which illustrates the sort of conflicts taking place between the old and the new at this period. The most notorious incident illustrating this hostility, and one of special interest here as it concerns access to the correspondence columns, was the rancorous dispute at the end of 1863 between Richard Cobden, Free Trade MP for the Lancashire Cotton Manufacturing Centre of Rochdale, and the chief Times editor, John T. Delane. Delane's paper had published a verbatim report from Rochdale of speeches delivered by Cobden and his colleague John Bright, where both railed against an unjust agrarian system, with the peasantry of England owning very, very little of the land. Over the following week, a series of leaders appeared in the Times claiming quite wrongly that Bright and Cobden had advocated the appropriation by force of the property of wealthy landlords. Cobden responded in a letter addressed to the editor of the Times, offering not only a defense against such accusations, but also an attack on the newspaper for taking corrupt advantage of its surreptitious relations with Palmerston's government under the cloak of anonymity. The editor at first announced that Cobden's letter would appear, but in fact published not the letter itself, but instead a reply justifying why it could not be inserted. Cobden forwarded copies of the rejected letter to sympathetic editors all over the country before penning an angry response to the Times. This led to an increasingly aggressive exchange between the two men, which continued for nearly 2 weeks, and Delane was soon forced to append his personal signature and private address with the ongoing correspondence widely reprinted in papers both friendly and unfriendly to Cobden. Before the Christmas, Delane begged to retire from the personal part of this controversy, while Cobden's response was to make the entire exchange available promptly in cheap pamphlet form, with his Lancashire colleague William Hargreaves issuing a more general analysis of the defects of the anonymous system not long afterwards. Just some brief illustrations. If you look at the yellow flashes to the left and right of these two letter extracts, this is the evidence of the postponement of the publication of Cobden's letter, and then the refusal to publish it. And if I can go on to the next one, 2 more letter extracts. Here we've got the physical evidence of the editor's signature and address, and his job as editor of the Times actually made clear, exposed for the first time, as far as I can make out, until Delane died in 1879. So this was a really unusual event when the editor's name and address and status were given. And finally, and I'll have to do this fairly briefly, here is the 2 covers of the 2 pamphlets that I mentioned dissecting the anonymous system. I'll just read the bit at the top. Cobden repeated his accusations against, I quote, the surreptitious relations which the Times, professedly anonymous and independent, maintains with the government, while, and this is at the bottom, that of Hargreaves detailed 8 Times staff members who had recently been in receipt of government patronage. And you think, well, what's that? That's the context, I think, that really helps to explain these compensated letters that I am drawing your attention to. Okay, so the 2 case studies, just 4 or 5 minutes for each of them, I hope. The S letters were during 3 years during the American Civil War from 62 to 65. I've called them a powerful platform for the Confederate lobbyists from Liverpool. There were 44 letters signed S, headed American Affairs. It's clear from the diaries that they were all written by a guy called James Spence. He wasn't a journalist. He was a Liverpool business and merchant who had very strong economic interests in relationships with the Confederate South. Um, and he had other jobs apart from writing letters to the Times. He was an associate of James Mason, the Confederate commissioner in Britain, who was involved in the Trent affair, who traveled to Britain on the Trent. And Spence was recruited as Liverpool secretary of the Southern Independence Association and also paid financial agent and lobbyist for the breakaway government. So this guy was at the same time receiving money from the Confederate authorities and writing letters for the Times under the illusion that they were private letters rather than compensated letters. And Spence did have a lot of influence on British public opinion in dragging them towards more sympathy towards the South. He had quite a big impact on government policy, even, and particularly he had a massive impact on the Times' position. The Times had begun trying to be neutral, but it ended up supporting the South quite strongly. And Spence's book, The American Union, was very positively reviewed by the Times in 62. And that shift helped to represent the shift of the policy of the Times. Other people have written a lot about Charles Mackay, who was a very pro-Confederate journalist, who was a special correspondent in the States. But I want to emphasize, I mean, I'm not the first person, but this is the first time, as far as I can see, that people have talked about the fact that these 44 letters over 3 years were all commissioned and compensated. I won't read out the examples. When he's talking about the war, he's talking a lot about the military side, saying that the South is doing a lot better than people pretend. But he's also talking about government policy and British public opinion. The thing I want to draw your attention to was there was a pamphlet published by Spence in the summer of 62, which actually let the cat out of the bag who S was. I don't know whether you can see it, it's very small print, by James Spence, author of The American Union and the S letters to the Times on American affairs. Now, readers wouldn't have known that they were compensated letters, but this was widely splashed in the Victorian media so that the disguise of S was pretty thin. It was not difficult to find out who Spence was. Anyway, that's my heavy political example of compensated commission letters. And the second one is much more, on this slide, if you can see it, I've just given you a couple of examples of my two case studies. On the left, you can see the flash, yellow flash at the bottom, S from Liverpool. And if you've got time, you can read the opening sentence. And on the right is my second case study. Harwich and Dovercourt are seaside resorts. It's signed at the bottom, Alpha, and you can see it stimulated correspondence from other people. Anyway, those are my two case studies, and I'll go on as quickly as I can to the second one. Working holidays at the seaside for the war correspondent. The guy behind the Alpha is Alpha for A and A for Austin. Charles Austin was a journalist who ended up at the Times round about 1867. Not that much has been written about him, but he is quite an interesting case. He's really best known as an overseas correspondent, a war correspondent. If you look on the left, there are two clips from two important wars that he recorded, that he reported on. The Abyssinian expedition, there he's special correspondent. The expedition started in Bombay and then ended up in East Africa. That's where he started for the Times. And then he ended up in Paris during the Franco-Prussian War, sending letters by balloon post from Paris, which was under siege by the Prussian forces. These were two of his key engagements for the Times. In between 67 and 70, he was based in London. He wrote a lot of leaders' editorials, quite a few book reviews. But like many of the leaders' writers, it was a pretty heavy duty job, and he was offered a holiday in the autumn of '69. But obviously, being a very hard-working man, he said, "Oh no, I'll do a working holiday. I'm going to do something much more fun." And he ended up traveling around a load of British seaside resorts, writing about them. And his main aim was to encourage bourgeois Southerners. I can just see Paul Lewis on the bottom. I'm not sure whether I should call Paul Lewis a bourgeois Southerner, but anyway, he wanted to persuade them not to go to Wildbad and smelly German resorts, but instead to go to British seaside resorts. And there was a strong commercial motive. The Times relied on advertising, and if you look at the Times in this period, there's lots of adverts for residential accommodation in these seaside resorts and for purchasing of property. But the most interesting things, he didn't do this in a very boring way. He turned it into a big laugh, a big joke, very witty, very light, still attractive. Lots of provincial newspapers copied these articles and were very pleased because apparently it did encourage a few bourgeois Englishmen to go to Scarborough and to Blackpool instead of to Wildbad. But the main point was that the tone of these letters is witty, hilarious, and light. I don't know whether you can see that, but the maps, he started off in Margate in Kent on the southeast coast, went up the east coast, ended up in the northeast coast to some places that aren't even seaside resorts. Alnwick isn't, and then went across to Blackpool and then to Llandudno in northern Wales, and send back to two columns on each of them. And they're informative, but they are above all entertaining. Since I'm a northerner, I feel as though I can sort of take these jokes. There's quite a lot of seaside resorts where you have pairs of resorts, a posh resort, a bourgeois resort, and a proletarian resort next to each other. And Austin, the alpha letter man, wrote pairing Blackpool and Lytham St Anne's and Scarborough and Whitby. When he was in Scarborough, he wrote, this is in the middle, "Whenever nature creates a poison, she thoughtfully places somewhere near the antidote. And it is perhaps for this reason that Whitby is so close to Scarborough." So I think that's quite funny. And then I'll just give one more before I shut up. Particularly when he was in Blackpool, he found it very difficult to understand what these Northwesterners were talking about. Both Alison and I come from the Northwest, so I hope we are understandable to some of you non-Northerners. Alpha suggested in his letter from Blackpool, some linguist ought to draw up a dialogue book for tourists in the north of England. If it had not been for the German waiters at the big hotels, I should have occasionally run the risk of being starved. So he is a genteel, sophisticated, cosmopolitan European, and he can understand the German waiters a lot better than the ones from Blackpool. Anyway, that's my light example. And just if I can have just 1 minute to finish off. The one point here I want to make is that the Times was not commissioning letters because it didn't get enough letters. The letters columns in the Times were flourishing, and as the decades went on, the number of letters increased, and there were some very, very healthy discussions, healthy interactions between letters to the editor and other parts of the paper, including leaders, of course. And they weren't just singleton letters. There are many famous cases of voluntary serial correspondences. I won't talk about them because of lack of time, but there's a heavy one, SGO, and a light one, the Bee Master, are two fairly well-known examples of series of letters that generated a lot of discussion and, in the case of the Bee Master, quite a lot of fun. Anyway, my point is, the letters columns were doing a pretty good job. They were a healthy example of journalism as public dialogue. These compensated letters, I think, are a major stain on what the Times was doing. The surreptitious nature, particularly of the Spence S letters to do with policy about the Civil War. And in a sense, these comic letters from the seaside resorts, they're almost exactly the opposite of the Times' policy about anonymity and depersonalized journalism, because they basically introduced by the back door personalities into the newspaper from a journalist, but in the disguise of a private letter writer. I finished there, but I'll just leave my list of primary resources on the screen for a few seconds. Not that you'll have time to look at it, but so that the YouTube version and you will be able to pause and look at them. So that's brief list of primary resources and then a brief list of secondary resources. Apologies, Graham Law and Jenny Taylor appear quite a lot there. So, thank you for listening. Questions or comments? And one thing I must do before I forget is going to the Times Estuary. I could only do it because of the really generous Curran Fellowship awarded by RSVP and funded from the request of the Eileen Curran Estate. It's a wonderful system. Thank you so much. Because of that, I could do this research. I hope it was, good value, but it was an amazing experience for me. And these days I'm a poor retired professor, so I can't afford to go unless I can get cash like this. So thanks to everybody at RSVP for paying for this jaunt to the depths of Essex. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Graham, for a wonderfully rich and exciting talk, and also for the acknowledgement to the Curran bequest and your Curran Award. Perhaps if you wouldn't mind sort of finishing sharing your screen so we can see everybody.
Indeed.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. So we do have about half an hour for discussion, questions, and comments. While you're collecting your thoughts, I am going to use Chair's privilege to ask something, first of all, and then I will open it up to others. So, Graham, if I may, I was really fascinated by, I think it was slide 14, where you had a letter from each of your really juicy case studies up on the screen. And I just wondered that this might be a very easy kind of yes, no kind of response, but I'm just wondering, was there any way that readers would have understood any code at all in the series of these compensated letters that they were commissioned? Was there any evidence, any graphic or textual code that would allow the readers to guess in some sense? Or do they look just the same in their kind of their tone, like textual evidence and the kind of graphic display of them on the page? Do they look just the same as the other letters that were not compensated?
That's a very good question indeed, and I'm not sure that I can confidently answer it because that was my first question to myself. But I think you'd think the giveaway would be the fact that these letters were so long, that they were written so professionally, and that there was a long series of them. But that doesn't quite give it away, because when you look, I mentioned the Godolphin SGO, there were quite a lot of other series of letters that were long, written professionally, that look and smell like professional work, but there's very clear evidence that they were not commissioned letters. So maybe some very smart people, the same sort of smart people who knew who wrote the leaders, who were in the know. But I think in terms of general readership, I don't think there was any real giveaway. And as I said, when Spence acknowledged that he was the author of the letters, he didn't give away that he was being paid for them. That was the one thing that kept hidden. So yeah, it's a great question and something I want to look at more as I carry on looking at the archive material more. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. I should have also begun by saying apologies to anyone from Essex. But thank you.
Yes.
Kathy, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Graham, that was utterly fascinating. It's a simple question, but I mean, I've never heard of this practice before. Do you know whether any other metropolitan or indeed provincial newspapers did this?
Yeah, I'm sure I've heard people have done research. Somebody was talking about the Pall Mall Gazette the other day. I've come across it in some of the lower depths of popular newspapers. I remember pornographic newspapers. But I suppose one of the things what I want to do is distinguish different types of fake letters. And there are some fake letters which are found in the new journalism where, as I said, you really get people making up stories and presenting them as real. And that's the sort of thing in the pornographic magazines. But in terms of this sort of, particularly the Spence heavyweight thing, I haven't come, and I was so shocked. That I mean, I have mixed feelings about the Times, but I was quite surprised that they did something particularly when it's a time when they were being accused by people like Cobden and Bright of such turpitude and such surreptitious behavior, that they were doing that at the same time. So yeah, I would love to find out. But the problem is there are very few newspapers that have such rich archives as the Times, and without the archival material, it's not the sort of information that people are going to broadcast. So unless you've got secret access to business records, because that's how I found. I just I found it's a letter. What does that mean? And then I kept finding references. There's a reference, for example, Courtney, where he did a series about free trade, and in the thing it says, "Oh, great letters. We're going to, of course, he will be paid exactly the same rate as for book reviews." So it's but that wasn't for public consumption. So yeah, if you find any, please tell me. But I hope I will. But lacking the archive, lacking rich archives, there might be the odd one that comes out, but
Wow.
I'm shocked when I found this.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, hi, Graham.
Hi, Patrick.
This was so great. And I'm excited about the impact of your work on the current index, which is going to be marvelous. And we're so grateful to you for working with us on that. I had a question of my own, but I noticed in the comments that Sarah has raised this important question of how the heck do people get into this archive? And do you have a set of tips for how to do it? It's a notoriously unfriendly, difficult place to work. I mean, I've heard Dallas Little talk about it and how restrictive it is and difficult. So any tips you have would be very welcome.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, if I can just self-advertise again, as a current fellowship recipient, you have to write a report. And I tried to write a report, being quite rude about being honest about getting at the Times Archive. And that, I believe, is posted on the RSVP webpage. So I would recommend people to go and find that and have a look. But yeah, the tip is sort of, grin and bear it, because it's worth it in the end. I mean, it is just so noisy. I mean, the archive is really, they don't give a damn about scholars, to be honest. It's there to sell pictures to other media, so that they've already got digitalized pictures. They're now going back to earlier issues before digitalization, scanning the pictures and selling them. That's their main aim. So there's a little room where the scholar sits, and next door there's a room with all these people doing the scanning. And Radio 4 is, if you're lucky, it's Radio 4. If you're unlucky, it's Radio 1 is blaring around. So it is pretty, and then the door gets left open quite a lot. So, but my point is, it is worth it. It is worth it. You contact by email. The guy is called Nick Mays, is the archivist. If anybody, I know some people like Laurel Brake. Is Laurel here today? I'm not sure. In the end, I don't think she can make it, but she's worked in the archive. But yeah, they don't make it easy for you. You're not supposed to take photographs. Sorry, that's a bit of a confession, isn't it? But
Well, thanks. Well,
Um,
I think we're all going to now. Kari has put the link to your report in the
Brilliant,
chat, so
brilliant.
that's
Thank
great.
you, Gary. Thank you so much.
Let me just squeeze in a quick question. Speaking of shocking customs at the Times, I know of one instance, for example, where Tom Taylor anonymously reviewed one of his own plays,
Yeah,
about which he was unstinting in his praise. I'm just saying.
excellent. Yeah,
Uh,
that's
have you run across other examples of people reviewing their own books and plays and so on?
Yeah, or even not necessarily their own, but also their close friends. The book, I mean, that was my second juiciest thing, was going through the book reviews, finding where a book reviewer for the Times is reviewing a book by another reviewer for the Times, and they're pretty close to each other. That would be okay if they acknowledged it up front and said, actually, he's my brother, but they don't. So, and in fact, I'm just starting to work on Tom Taylor because of all the theatre reviews, and I'm not at all surprised because he is one of the most prolific of the non-book reviewers in the Times, and I'm just starting to collate Tom Taylor for the current index. So I'm sure I will come across a few more of these. But again, unless you know who wrote the things, you can't see what surreptitious things are going on. But yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of that going on, reviewing. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can see that we're going to be able to create a new taxonomy of misdeeds. Newsletters to the Times and periodical misdeeds and reviewing and puffery is really fascinating. Thank you. Paul, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead. And it's good to see you here.
Yes, well, it's very nice to be here. Lovely to see Graham. I haven't seen him for a very long time. Graham, why did the Times do this? I mean, even then, the Times is supposed to be an objective report, and it still likes to think it is that. Was this a way of them campaigning for the Confederates, which seems a strange position for the newspaper to take?
I don't know where this illusion that the Times was objective in the 19th century comes from. I mean, for example, on other things apart from something very, very emotive like the American Civil War, I mentioned about the context, about the abolition of the taxes on knowledge, the newspaper stamp, the tax on advertising. There, the Times took a very, very strong position. Similarly, on the Reform Act of 1832, the Times took a very clear position. And that's why people like Cobden and Bright got so angry, because they did have very, very strong. When you look at the letters, which is the other juicy bit of it, when you see correspondence between Delane and Walter and leading members of the government, you can see that there is a very, very intimate relationship going on, so that the idea that they're objective, I mean, I don't particularly object to newspapers. What seems to me to be objectionable is the surreptitiousness of it. Yeah.
Yes, I certainly agree with you on that. But things like taxes on knowledge, you can imagine, you can expect newspapers to campaign on that, and even on certain political
No, but
things.
the Times was not particularly in favor of reducing, because the Times' monopoly benefited from the taxes on knowledge. It had a monopoly on advertising, and actually the tax didn't make that much difference. So the Times was actually not that much in favor of the taxes, so that it's quite the opposite. I mean, you'd think if the Times was really a free trade journal, it would be, its position would have been very different. It wasn't. It was very much in favor of its own monopoly.
Mm.
Sorry, I'm becoming very negative about the Times here. If you want to,
it's interesting. It took the Confederates' point of view, though, because was that a popular thing in Britain at the time?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, today we cannot separate slavery and the Civil War, and they should be intimately connected. But in fact, even Spence, who was very much pro-Southern, he was anti-slavery. His reasons for supporting the Confederacy were not support for slavery. So the politics of the situation, but in Britain, there was a lot of sympathy for the South. And obviously the Times wasn't just reflecting public opinion, it was helping to generate public opinion.
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions or comments for Graham? Lindy, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead. Oh, please unmute yourself, Lindy, so we can hear you.
Yes, is that better?
Thank you.
Sorry.
It is. No worries.
I
Thank you.
like to be quiet. I was just wondering if there were any letters, real letters, uncompensated letters from other readers that criticised or queried either of the two series that you've been talking about. And if so, is there any indication of any response to those in the letters that were the compensated letters?
Yeah, the answers are sort of yes, lots, and then no, I haven't found any yet. So, certainly, generally, Letters to the Times did create a dialogue between readers, but also a dialogue with the editors in the leaders column. That was very, very common. So that, yes, there were plenty of responses in my two case studies, the ones I've looked at very closely, there were plenty of responses to the S letters from Liverpool, and also even more, given the numbers, to the seaside resort cases. The seaside resort ones were it was difficult to get angry about the seaside resort ones because of the tone. So they were either sort of joking responses, or quite a lot were local people saying, yeah, if you come to market, you should also go to this and do that. So that it was generally sort of local people trying to generate business. But in the case of the S letters from Liverpool, obviously, I've talked about the Times being pro-Southern, but there was a conflict in British public opinion, and it was fought out very, very strongly. Spence's pamphlets were very important, but there were plenty of people writing back. I didn't mention in the presentation what I should have done. Leslie Stephen wrote a very, very important little book on the history of the Times's coverage of the American Civil War. And in that, he attacked Spence very, very strongly for his book and pamphlet, but didn't recognized that the S letters were by him and didn't talk about those. So yes, there was a debate. But again, I haven't seen anybody saying something like, "Oi, you're getting paid for this. This is a compensation." Nothing remotely like that. And as I said, generally, if you look at other series of letters, ones that I've got clear evidence they were non-compensated, similarly, you get lots of debate. I've just been looking at some this morning at during the, what do we call it these days? Not the Indian Mutiny, but the conflict in India in 1857. There's a guy, Sir Charles Trevelyan, who wrote a series of letters under the pseudonym Indophilus, and I think he wrote, I can't remember, it's about 20 letters, a dozen, 15 letters. And I thought, these look pretty dodgy, as though because they were supporting the Times line. But in fact, to my own satisfaction, I've been able to prove that they were private letters, not being compensated by the Times. But yes, there's lots of dialogue that follows these letters, but nothing that exposes the dubious nature of the compensated letter.
Okay, thank you, Graham. So there's a comment from Matt Poland in the chat, which I'll read out, and then let's go to Andrew after that, and then Prithi, who have their hands up. So Matt Poland asks that he'd love to hear more about the way that the seaside letters treated Northerners as anthropological subjects, or perhaps objects. And, I asked the question myself as a Northerner, and you yourself, Graham, are also a Mancunian, but this is really fascinating. Could you maybe elaborate on the relationship between the North, the Northerners, and the seaside resorts a little bit more?
I think those comic things that I read out are really the clearest indication of that treating the Northerners as anthropological subjects. But as I said, the main aim of the letters was commercial. It was trying to encourage people to go to these resorts. So the fun was fairly light-hearted. It was not saying, don't go to Manchester, you'll get beaten up. Don't go to Llandudno, you'll get some nasty diseases. It was nothing like that. In the end, it was an appeal for people to try out these places. And the comedy, I think, really was part of the appeal, and sort of say, because there'd been discussion sort of before that about Margate, particularly whether Margate was so awful that respectable gentlemen should ever go anywhere near Margate. So yeah, the comedy is not vicious. Even as a northerner, I could laugh along with it, and I thought particularly the idea that, you know, he could understand the German waiter in the hotel in Blackpool better than he could these Blackpool people, I thought was quite good. So, but yeah, in the end, the most important thing is there's a commercial motive. It is encouraging people, and that's the way it was taken up. When you look at the letters in response, when you look at local newspapers, Blackpool newspapers, Scarborough newspapers that reprinted the article, they took it in pretty good heart and saw it as a good advert and hoped that it would bear financial fruit in the following holiday season. So does that answer the question? I'm not sure.
I think that does for me, hopefully for Matt too. It's really curious how follow the money is one of your research kind of questions here in the methods. There's so much money invested in this. But let me go on now, because we're running out of time, but I'd like to squeeze in both Andrew and Prithi.
Brilliant.
Put their hands up. Thank you. Andrew, please go ahead.
Thanks. This is absolutely fascinating, Graham. I'm loving it. I want to return to Paul's question. Why? What's the policy behind the decision to pay someone for what appears to be a letter which readers wouldn't expect to be paid? What is there a pattern? Because the explanation you just gave for the seaside letters seems very different from. I could understand the S letters. The Times wanted the point of view of supporting the South to be put over, but they didn't want to be associated too closely with it. That kind of makes
exactly.
sense. But what about the other cases? Is there any sort of pattern to it? What's the policy behind it?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, those two cases are very, very opposite. But the one I can come up with is that the Times was struggling in the face of new personalized journalism. They defended themselves in various ways. I mean, E.S. Dallas, my man E.S. Dallas, I think has given one of the best defenses of anonymous journalism. But clearly, the Times was aware that they were losing out to some of the new papers. And I think what they were doing was introducing new journalism by the back door. These seaside letters by Alpha, by Charles Austin, were adding a bit of fun and a bit of lightness. There's quite a lot of discussion amongst the Time editors about, during the parliamentary season, the Times is absolutely stuffed with political debates with verbatim coverage, pages and pages and pages. And obviously for some readers, that was tremendously appealing. But there's also a lot of comment about people loved it when Parliament was on recess, and there was a lot more juicy material, including book reviews of a wide range of books, history, biography, travel writing, literature, science, you name it. And as I said, I think they wanted something softer. They wanted something like, but they didn't want to look as though they have any truck with the new journalism. So you put it in the letters. That's the best explanation I can come up with. Does that make sense?
It does for the seaside letters, but for the S letters, I'm not so sure, really.
Oh, the S letters was politics. I mean, that they didn't want to be seen to pushing too hard. And so therefore it was very useful to have this very powerful voice speaking as though an independent voice. And actually, the Times in the leaders, they did often refer to the S letters and sort of say, it's not just us saying this, look at S's book, look at S's pamphlet. So that clearly it was a way of adopting a political position without pushing too hard on it. As you said, your description at the beginning, I think exactly hits the nail on the head regarding the S letters.
Sock puppeting, I think it's called nowadays, isn't it?
Yes. This guy, Charles Mackay, who was the most pro-Southern correspondent, because there was other people. W.H. Russell ended up in the States. Antonio Gallenga, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, the Italian guy, they were much more pro-Northern, whereas the Times had this one journalist, Mackay, who was recruited in the spring of '62, and they wanted something more, and they didn't want to have two. So having the voice of Spence, apparently independent, in the letters column was very, very useful indeed.
Okay, thank you. I think I'd really love to finish our session with Prithi. Please do go ahead. Thank you.
I thought you said you were going to finish the session, period. But thank you, Graham. In some ways, I think my question is sort of piggybacking on Andrew's question and a comment Kathy had in the chat about why not just pay people, and make it a special correspondent. So this is great talk, super wonderful. And I'm glad you kept in your rude comments about the archive in the report, and they're not so rude. But my question, and forgive me if you said this, but at the precise moment at the start of your talk when you were defining commissioned letters and saying you're not calling them fake because I froze, my Zoom froze, so I missed your definition. But I wonder if so part of what I'm hearing you talk about, and certainly in your answer to Andrew's question is I want to sort of tease apart commissioned and compensated, right? Because it's the compensation part that feels surreptitious to you. It's the compensation part that should shock us, that these folks were paid for doing this thing that seemingly appears to be independent. Because commissioned was happening all the time. As Kathy says, you had special correspondents, excuse me, who were commissioned. And Russell is the sort of, classic example, although Sala is too, but Russell was the classic example, sent to India for the uprising of 1857. He arrived in 1858, or sent to the US. So it's that it's the compensated to appear independent that seems to be the sort of hitch. And so I wonder, I just, if you could speak a little bit to teasing apart commissioned and compensated and independence in the letters. And I'll just quickly, I know we're very short in time, but to me, like one of the things, anyway, no, you know what? Maybe I won't say the bit about stylistic because I wanted to pick up on Kathy's comment about stylistic, but I won't because it will take too long. Maybe just if you could speak to the compensation commissioned part and tease those parts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so surprised when you say it's the compensation that's shocking. I find the commissioning equally shocking because commissioning a special correspondent to go to India, to go to the Crimea, to go to the States is totally different from commissioning a letter that appears to readers as though it is a private communication. So for me, commission and compensated are just two sides of the same coin, and they're both equally nefarious.
Can I just pop in and say that it's sort of in the Indian press that I work on, Anglo-Indian press, it was a sort of given that letters to the editors were, I mean, often they would sort of say, we sent off an agent, somebody who works in the office. They didn't call them correspondents, so so, and maybe that's not, the Times shouldn't be doing it because it's supposed to be independent and all that. So I think for me, but maybe you're right. Both should be equally shocking.
I mean, I'd love to hear more about that. I mean, because I've been trying to find sort of discussions which show that this was a commonplace activity, but I haven't been able to find much evidence to support that. So this is in the Indian vernacular press or in the Anglo-Indian press you were talking about?
Anglo-Indian press, and I have a short section in my first chapter about in the Anglo-Indian press where letters to the editor. Yeah.
Right. No, I should have looked at that bit already, but yeah. Anyway, as I said, for me, the thing when your screen froze, the thing I was talking about was saying, I think fake is a much broader word than commissioned stroke compensated, particularly because things like representing fiction as fact is covered by fake letters, and there's a lot of examples of that. But I wanted to distinguish between that and what I am calling the representation of a professional correspondence as though it were a private correspondence. So for me, I'm trying to focus on that aspect of it. And for me, that's why commissioned comes to be just as bad as compensated, because it's that private public divide that is being sort of cheated on, really. Anyway, thanks. Great question, and I promise I will do my homework better and look at the chapter you mentioned.
Thank you so much, everybody. Special thanks to Graham for such a fabulous talk. It's really exciting and juicy revelations from the archive. Completely gripping. Thank you, Graham, and thanks to everybody for being here. A fantastic discussion. This will appear on our YouTube series if you'd like to hear it again very shortly. And then just a plug for our next Digi event on the 15th of May, the same time, 8 a.m. Pacific, when we're having a roundtable on expanding the field with all the previous winners of that prize, which is hosted by Victorian Periodicals Review and also RSVP. And Kathy Malone, the editor of VPR, will be chairing. Okay, thank you again, everybody. See you next time.